Good morning, evening, whatever time you are tuning in the program here at allpointstv.com. I'm George Moss, the host of the program called What's Going On, and we come on at 2 o'clock, and that's every Monday from 2 o'clock to 3. And today we will be preceding the program called Satura's Black History Corner that comes on around 3:30, and it manages to stay around to about 4 o'clock. And that would be the hostess, Mrs. Catherine Hunter Williams and Miss Catherine Blake. And they'll be here in the studio very shortly, coming to you at 3:30. And they always have something very exciting to say, and I run home and watch it on my own network, my computer. And I hope you will stay tuned for that program also if this program here ends at 3 o'clock or somewhere around that time. Of course, you can catch us anytime at your convenience. We are taping so that it will be available on your own network service at your convenience and at your time of choosing. And we are here for your convenience. Hope you will tell us about what you think about us out there, as we're always trying to improve ourselves, and your input is necessary for us to do that. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Black History, since this is Black History Month. And it will be the month, by the way, for those of you who are wondering if we are going to acknowledge it, and I hope it will be acknowledged more widely elsewhere, and that is the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Malcolm X, who was assassinated on the 21st of February 1965, and this is the 50th anniversary of that event, that tragic event, where a number of people that were making a difference in society were assassinated during that decade, some of them dying from being involved in the human rights movement, now called, pretty much generally called the civil rights movement, but the human rights movement that was in fact advanced by Black Americans and white Americans trying to bring about the fuller fulfillment of the Constitution mandates that all, first of all, in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, and all women, and the exercising of that idea in the carrying out and manifestation of the rights therein guaranteed to all in the Constitution, particularly in the aftermath of the passage of the amendments, the Human Rights Amendments. Not only the 13th, 14th, and 15th, but also the amendment passed in 1919, the 20th Amendment, that guaranteed that we would not have any deprivation of the right to vote based upon the right to vote based upon sex. We already had that in terms of race, national origin, color, or previous condition of servitude. So we are still perfecting the American experiment, which started really with the upheaval that was caused by the taxation policies of King George III in Parliament. And this was a taxation war under the banner of no taxation without representation, but really was against taxation in general. I mean, taxation with representation don't make no better than taxation without representation. You know, they try to frame it so that I guess we're taxed to death. What the Tea Party taxed to death already, taxed enough already, and we don't mind being taxed as long as we can put you in office and then you vote taxes against our purses. We don't mind as long as we have representation. But really, if you go back and look at it and read it for yourself, you'll see that they really came here because they were tired of the taxation policies of Europe, and they were running to escape the taxes, thinking that what they earned they should keep, and the government has the right to seize the wealth of those that have created the wealth by their own efforts. It didn't belong to the government, and so they couldn't stop the taxation. They had even cut off the head of King Charles I in 1649 as a tax rebellion. I don't know why we can't bring that out into the open. I mean, they covered it up back in that time period, but this is now, what, 300 years later? and there's no sense there's no reason for us to keep it hidden. That was a tax revolt that they had in England under the Stuart kings, and they not only did a beheading of Charles I, but they threw the Stuarts out of power for 11 years, from 1649 to 1660, and put Oliver Cromwell in the place of the kings. And then in the restoration of the Stuarts later on, which would have been, and don't tell me, in 1660, when they brought in James II, and let me make sure that's right. Yeah, James II. No, that would have been, let's see, yeah, James II. See, James I was 1603 to 1625. Charles I, 1625 to 1649. And then Charles II, it was from 1660 to 1685. And then James II from 1685 to 1688. I want to make sure I get the date straight. But it was really a tax issue. And they threw the Stuarts out of power for a while until they can get them under control. Because this idea of the government seizing your wealth and seizing your money and taxing you and making people believe that their money belongs to the government, it's no less egregious when you talk about taxing the rich, and they try to act like that doesn't have any fallout on those of us underneath the rich, because the rich are the ones that create the jobs with the surplus capital. And so when they act like when they're attacking the rich, we shouldn't be worried about that, because it doesn't have any residual effects. And it does have residual effects, because who are the ones creating the jobs in the country? The people that have the capital to do so. And they use the excess profits to make more money. And when they make more money, they create more jobs, and then more person can have income, and that benefits the whole society. It does not benefit society for the government to seize it and then put it into the tax base where they're using it to buy votes.
You know, I was reading this book. It is actually talking about John Rawls' book, The Theory of Justice. John Rawls, you know, and his criteria for a just society would be that if a certain portion of the population had their lifestyle, you know, expanded, or their standard of living improved, they'd have to pull the lower half up a certain amount to be considered a just society. Well, they demonstrated pretty much every time we've had a major influx of capital gains and and money coming in from people providing jobs and making money for themselves, the lower echelon of our society has been pulled along with it. And it's like Rush Limbaugh, when I was listening to him 20-some years ago, he actually made a point. He said, our poor people, our poverty people, have houses they're living in with centralized heating or air conditioning units, have computers, have access to cable, internet, they have computers, they have access to medical care, they have adequate food. Yes. That's even considered the poverty level. Yes. So, I mean, okay, it does poverty to exist. I mean, I'm not denying that. But our poverty is basically like a middle class for some other countries.
That's exactly the point.
Yeah.
We don't seem to get that when you talk about poverty in the United States, you're talking about the middle class. In every other part of the world, practically speaking, there are some exceptions to it, but generally the rule is that when you're in other parts of the world, our underclass, our poverty group, the ones that are in the lower sectors of society, would be in the top echelons in most societies around the world.
Now, Dr. Mark Perry, one time years ago up here at U of M, actually, he cited, it was after I left U of M, but he put it on his blog, that if you actually look at just Genesee County, and this is a poverty-stricken area, okay, in Flint especially, if you look at that, well, we have the money coming in, floating around here, it's like it equals the GDP of several small nations, third world what they consider third world nations in the county alone and in a impoverished area. So I mean that just goes to show them how much wealth the spigot that pipeline was immense. And I mean, look at it. You got
a pipeline, like you said.
Well, I remember reading. I filled out a form one time. I saw this form from something that was really from the '60s, and they had like the professional class. You know, the income levels for professional class. It was like around a little over $10,000 a year. 12,000, I think it was, considered to be a professional class person. The average shop worker made considerably. We actually had the highest per capita income coming in at that time, any person in the country. and yet they were still satisfied with it. You know, the people who worked with unions and stuff weren't still satisfied. So basically, it's a relative position. Everybody wants more, but when they get 10% more than their spending and expenditures goes up 20 to 30% more, so they never are meeting this imaginary mark. They think it's a satisfactory level.
Mm-hmm. Well, they never want us to figure out that you can make profit and money by sitting in a room somewhere. You've got to expand the economy in order to increase your own wealth. In other words, it is Ayn Rand again who's talking about the virtue of selfishness. And what she is talking about is what the reality is, and that is that selfishness has a virtue. You cannot satisfy your own selfish ends by maintaining selfishness, that you don't want anybody else included in your selfish inclinations. Your inclinations may well be selfish, but you cannot satisfy those intentionalities unless you involve some other persons in it so they benefit from your selfishness as well.
See, I think what she was brilliant in is she took the term selfish, which people use as a derogatory title.
Yeah, they do.
But the thing is, if you actually define it, actually if you go back to what Nietzsche's idea, and I don't think you talk about the morality. Mm-hmm. Basically, everything is like it's a label put on those who are resentful of what you possess. Mm-hmm. Anybody can be considered you to be greedy or selfish if they want something you have and you're not forthcoming giving it to them. So basically, she took the term selfish, which was supposed to be in a derogatory and pejorative sense, and said, okay, let's look at what really this means.
Right.
Anybody could be resentful of what anybody has. I mean, two guys who are living underneath a viaduct or a bridge somewhere one could be saying the other one was selfish because he didn't give him his extra blanket or his extra food ration or whatever. So it's all a relative position. Everybody who's got something is going to be resentful of somebody else who's got more than they do. Mm-hmm. But it's always based upon that standard. I mean, it's if they don't have what you have, then you owe it to them, or you should feel guilty for having it.
Yeah. Well, she's making a very important point that you're making, John, and what they're really asking people to do, and they're doing it under the umbrella of selfishness, is they're asking people to be sacrificial animals, that they are supposed to sacrifice their own sovereignty and their own needs for the needs of others, and that is making people sacrificial animals by asking them to sacrifice themselves in the service of other people, even above their own needs.
Well, and then a lot of the leftists will
suicide.
The leftists will try to use the Christian concept of morality to say that, if you're not giving away much, you're not being Christian. I mean, they mock Christianity for all that, but they always want to use that as a hook that you're not giving more or enough, in their opinion. So basically, but Christ said himself, greater is no life give than his own lay down his life for his friends. He doesn't say for the general population. Mm-hmm. He says for his friends. So there's actually, he puts it in parameters of it's somebody you're connected with. Well, your friends are probably people you share values with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, even the appellation "love your neighbor as yourself" is a self-serving kind of idea as well. If you don't love your neighbor as you love yourself, then your community falls apart. In other words, with that, and in a lot of ways, that agrees with Ayn Rand's idea, because what Rand is talking about in the Virtue of Selfishness is that you should, in fact, only be sacrificial toward those who have some meaning in your own life. In other words, what's the benefit to you? I was making a comment to one of my friends that if someone who is a loved one, I can't swim, but if a loved one falls in the water and is drowning, I'm going to do all I can to get in that water. I know I can't swim, but I got to risk something in the process there, because the person that is in fact drowning means something to me, and without that person, my life is in fact diminished. But in terms of a stranger, it ain't gonna happen.
Well, see, another thing, my ballywick too, my person. I don't mean to commandeer your show, but another thing is I can't stand the phrase unconditional love. And I try to get people to feel that, what they mean by that. And so what is that? In their estimation, you're supposed to have this free-flowing love for all humanity, all the world. Well, then I said, they say, well, I love my children. They use an example. I love my children unconditionally. I said, you love your children because they're your children. Do you love your neighbor's kid as much as you do? And they hate to admit it, but I don't see how that expression could have merit. You cannot. I mean, you love things because of conditions, attributes it possesses, or they possess. This free-floating love thing just galls me.
Me too. I do everything conditionally, and I love selfishly. I love because of the fact that I get something out of the proposition myself. I don't just love everybody just for the sake of loving everybody. I get something out of the deal. And this idea that you're going to put someone above the love that you have for yourself, the self-love aspect, is a matter. It's almost a form of personal suicide. You're asking a person to forego the love that they have for themselves for the love they have for someone else. It means nothing in their own life.
Another thing is
so I love selfishly.
Well, see, another thing is too, Christianity, based upon you don't want you're convinced you have an immortal soul, that it has an existence after it shakes off this earthly coil. So you don't want your immortal soul to suffer torment and discomfort and isolation and desolation. So you choose to become a Christian. But that's all that decision is a self-interested motivation.
Yeah.
It's selfish because you don't want your soul to suffer eternal damnation. So I mean, everything could go if it's not based upon your self-interest, it's not rational.
Yeah, the whole premise of Christianity, you pray because you feel that by praying, the deity will recognize the prayer, and you will get some blessing out of it. If we thought that sending our prayers out had no merit and no one was listening to the prayer and we're not going to get a benefit from it, I don't think anybody would be on their knees at night praying with it. Well, you think they would be on their knees?
I mean, it's all motivated self-interest. So you make petitions or supplications to your deity, your God. And I believe in God, and I mean, I consider myself a Christian, so I'm not denouncing that or denigrating it. Right. But I'm looking at the brass tacks of it. You got to look at their motivation. The reason why people move toward, even if the atheists are right, and there is no God, we feel this need to go try to get to something out there higher because we want our needs met. It might be a spiritual need, it might be an emotional need, it might be the need of somebody we care about suffering and maybe potentially dying, and we're trying to to petition enough to get them off that list to die. I mean, but it's all motivated of self-interest. Like you said about you were trying to save your loved one. You couldn't imagine your life without this person. So that person has value because they are so intrinsic, too much to you, too connected to you. But that willingness to sacrifice yourself is not a coercion placed on the outside from somebody else. Right. It's on your own self.
Right, and it does not surrender my own sovereignty to, in fact, sacrifice to be in a sacrificial mode, potentially losing my own life for trying to save someone who has meaning in my life. That's not sacrificial. Because what I'm doing here is I'm extending myself into another person's life who has meaning in my own life. And that would be very different from jumping in the water and for someone who's a stranger. I'm not saying we should not be concerned about all life, but there's a special thing that goes on in those who have meaning in your life. That's why you feel close to your family members and those who are your friends. And those who are in your familiar circles, you have a different relationship to those persons. And it doesn't say love the world as you love yourself, because how would you? I mean, I hear people saying, "I love black people." What does that mean?
I mean, that doesn't mean.
What does that mean?
I mean, let's face it.
You don't know all the black people.
Okay, I'm gonna make the shocking revelation, so prepare yourself. But you're black, right? Okay,
Yeah.
Okay. Do you love everybody you see around there? People you don't know because they have black faces.
Yeah, black people
that's
in my house. I don't love them.
No, I mean it's like, what does it mean? Basically, everything boils down to your self-interest. I mean, you don't want the person who died in a car wreck or whatever, because that person may be the cure for cancer through him or her.
Right.
Let's face it. You don't know the worth of everybody, so you're extending the possibility of worth to all people because then you value all life. You never know how that can impact you. Like the reason why we should hate injustice, and if you're rational, is because you fear that injustice may be also applied to you at some point. So you want to fight it somebody as you don't want to see somebody railroaded in the system. That's what it motivates it out. And if that's wrong, then I don't know what else can motivate people.
Yeah. Well, if you're not motivated by selfishness, there's no way to be motivated. You have to be self-motivating, but what motivates you? To increase the quality of your own life. And anyone you can, and that can happen in a vacuum. You got to have some service, something that some meaning you have in the lives of others, and they have to have meaning in your life. I don't see any thing wrong with selfishness. I don't see anything wrong with greed. And I think when I hear people like the president saying, for example, that when did greed become a virtue, to me that shows no understanding, because if a person does not have greed, I don't mean envying the materiality that is in the lives of other people. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about greed as a motivating influence. A person that wants more, but you can't get more without serving the larger interest that goes outside the parameters of your own space, and it has involved more people than yourself. You just can't be greedy in a room and then service your greed. I keep coming back to this example of the person who was a loafer. And, you know, they have this commercial that says, when the little boys in the classroom, they say, he says that, he says to the teacher, my dad is a loafer. And the teacher says, Johnny, don't come in here putting your father down. And the boy was saying his son was making bread. He was a loafer. You know, making loaves of bread. And so, but the loafer, which is the person making the loaf of bread, didn't know me from Adam. Didn't care about me as such. But he serviced my needs this morning before I got up, because by him getting up at whatever time he got up to make that loaf of bread, make sure it was in the store, particularly when I was growing up and we couldn't afford to buy the bread the night before because we didn't have the money. My mom found a way to get the money, and the next morning she had it, and so the bread is outside the store, waiting for the store to open. We go up there and put the money in the bread box. That's how honest our community was. We were poor, but we were honest, and we go in there and put the money in the bread box, take the bread out of the bread box, and take it home. And the owner of the store would come later on, maybe 2 hours later, and open the store up. We were in school at that time, and he'd go in there and see a loaf of bread missing. He knew the money was in the bottom of the box, because we would not take the bread without paying for it. But the loafer that made the bread didn't know us, and wasn't trying to necessarily do any service to us, because he didn't know who we were. But he did a service nevertheless, because in his greed, which is that he wanted our money and he couldn't get it with a gun, I'm not standing there for him to come there and wait by the box. He comes there and holds me up. I'm at home when that bread is made, and then when they put it outside the store, I only go there after they put it out there, and then the loafer, meaning the bread maker, that loaf the bread, is not there standing by the bread box. I go to the bread box, get the bread out. He serves my needs. I put the money in the box, and I serve his needs. He wants my money. I want the bread. And in exchange, in the greed we both had, because I want to eat, and that needs got to be satisfied. And the loafer makes the money off of my interest, and he serves his interest at the same time. That's how greed operates. And anyone doesn't understand that, as the president doesn't seem to understand it, is talking this nonsense about when did greed become a virtue. Well, there's a virtue in that. It's always a virtue. It starts being a virtue when you turn what is greed. It's not really greed, it's envy, because you want to covet. It says that if you notice it, there is a commandment about covet, not a commandment about greed. It says thou shouldn't covet the neighbor's house, and that includes his wife and what's in his house and his television set and things you took out of my window and things of that sort. And it's about coveting. I don't covet anything that somebody else has. That belongs to them. And I wish the government would stop coveting, our paychecks so much and talking about raising the taxes. If I'm supposed to be happy that you're raising on the rich, because in raising on the rich, you're also affecting those who are underneath the rich, because they're servicing the ends of those underneath them by being rich. They want more wealth, because the person wants to outdo anybody that takes this. They want to outdo themselves, because you're continuing to live, and the longer you live, the more you want to advance. You don't want to stop growing and stop actually accumulating materiality just because you have material. How many persons that worked last year don't want to work anymore. I mean, and do nothing. And everybody wants to continue to do things that are useful in their lives. They may not be on the same job, but you don't stop working. I'm retired, but I'm still working. I still work. I work in other ways. Sometimes I'm working. Most of the time I'm working. I'm not getting paid for it. But you don't stop working, because that's how you continue to improve your quality of life. What do you want? You want more. You want more quality of life. And sometimes the quality of life is not in terms of things you can touch. You improve your condition, and you're greedy for more in more ways in which can be materially, realized in visible ways. But the greed factor motivates you, because you want to have more of that quality of life that is enhanced by certain material things, some immaterial things, and greed is the motivation behind all of it. Well, anyway, we come to this month, and this is Black History Month that was set up, first of all, as a black. It really was not Black History Month, nor was it Black History Week, because black was a term that was in fact pejorative at that time. And to say black, I can remember in my own neighborhood, to say black was a fighting word. You call somebody, you put the modifier on a person by saying you black so and so. Now the so and so part was bad enough, but when you put black on it, that pejorative, that term became even more pejorative because black was almost like a swear word. And so when you said black something in that time period when I was coming up, those were fighting words. It was Negro History Week when Carter G. Woodson, the founder of that, of the idea we need to have some institutional study of what blacks had done at that time, called Negroes and called colored people and things like of that sort. I mean, Du Bois was hollering we ought to capitalize the word Negro, but black was not a popular term at that time, and I don't know anyone who thought they were being complimented when they said black. So it was Negro History Week. We were a lot saner when we called ourselves Negroes, by the way, and we're less sane now we're calling ourselves black. I'm not saying there's a quid pro quo relationship between the two, but there's something lost in the proposition moving from one to the other in terms of the psychology between the two uses of the term. And I think that's what Henry Louis Gates is saying, by the way, in his book called For Colored People, which is called Colored People. And we have an organization that has the word colored people in its name, which nobody's complaining about. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And that's where that comes from. Well, Carter G. Woodson, when he set Negro History Week up, or the study of black people as we call it today, set it up as Negro History Week. And he set it up in the month of February because in that month you had two great figures on both sides of the slavery divide. You had the great 16th President Abraham Lincoln, who is great in some ways and not great in some other ways, but that's all of us. And the 16th President was pushed into history and made a standout in history books because of the fact that there was a war born during this time period, and there were some things that were therefore extenuated based upon the war, and there were some things that took place as a non-intended consequence, but that's on his watch, and that's the credit he should be given for it because it happened on his watch. The Emancipation Proclamation, for example. And then out of that later on, laying a foundation, he wasn't around to see it, but he laid a foundation for the 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves in the country, and all slavery was officially ended, but the 13th Amendment was passed. Lincoln had been assassinated in March, going into April of 1865. The 13th Amendment is not passed until December of that year, and Lincoln is dead by that time period. But he laid the foundation for it, and also for the citizenship that was therefore now made possible by the freeing of the slaves, and then the eventual prohibition about denying the right to vote of citizens based upon color and national origin, the previous condition of servitude, all that was made possible by Lincoln's efforts. I mean, the war that was suborned based on a number of things. This war, by the way, was also a war over taxation. But anyway, out of it came these other things. Some of it was not intended, but it happened on Lincoln's watch, and therefore Lincoln should get some of the credit for it. And out of that comes something like, what was that, about 50 years later? We're talking about 1865, and then we're talking about 1926. About 70-some odd years later, we're talking about the need to now move the pendulum further, and that would be then to recognize the full humanity of the people, and that means to recognize them as a historical presence. And that's what Carter G. Woodson was doing in terms of his founding what he called Negro History Week. And he had a problem even selling it under the idea, well, I have a week for it. Because you can go back and read that at Howard University, for example, when William Leo Hansberry tried to get it institutionalized at the what is called the Black Harvard. Howard University at that time was supposed to have been the premier black college in the country, above all the other colleges. He had a hard time selling an idea at Howard University, and when William Leo Hansberry was pushing that, he was somewhat of a I don't know if you would say he was a proselyte of Carter G. Woodson, or if he was a protege. I don't know if you would say that, but they were contemporary figures, and they had the same idea about we need to have some acknowledgement that there is a historical record we can, in fact, attach to those who are newly freed, and they're not without some history, and you can validate their historical presence by, you can validate it by going and looking at what they've accomplished in history as well, and place them on the same plateau as other American citizens. That's what they're trying to do. And so Carter G. Woodson puts into place Negro History Week, and then William Leo Hansberry, and if you know the name Hansberry, you know that's would be the uncle of Lorraine Hansberry, the one that did the wonderful play called Raisin in the Sun, and she had taken that idea from Langston Hughes' poem, What Happened to a Raisin in the Sun, that drive like a soar and then run, and she took the idea and then put it into a play in the 1950s. He had written the poem back in the time of the Harlem Renaissance, and it became a play and then a movie starring Sidney Poitier, one of the great movies that Poitier made. I think it was his best movie, not the one he got the Oscar for, which is Lizards of the Field. He got an Oscar for that in 1964. I think that his best starring role was Raisin in the Sun. I don't think he ever exceeded the role he played there, and I think that's a classic. But she's the niece of William Leo Hansberry. So if you know Lorraine Hansberry, then you can make the connection from her to William Leo Hansberry. And I think it's William Leo Hansberry, by the way, on page 27 of this book called Personalities and Antiquity, that's written by Arthur Weigel, that he is talking in that book about a person that called him up, that was saying that he wanted to meet with Arthur Weigel, who was a foremost Egyptologist at that time, and he didn't mention the name, but he described the person, and he said that when the person called him on the phone, he thought he was talking to a white person, because the accent was so learned, and he just took it for it could not be a black person. And when he said that, when the person said he wanted to meet with Weigel, and Weigel agreed to do so, and later on when Hansberry showed up at his doorstep, the maid took him in to meet Weigel, and Weigel was surprised to find that this was according to his own description, a dark-skinned black person. Well, that right there eliminated the only other possibility that could have been at that time, and that would have been W.B. Du Bois. And if you know W. Du Bois, you know he was a light-skinned black. So he was not describing him. So you could figure out who the other person was. And that was William Leo Hansberry, who was a classical scholar at that time and was learned in the, his student, Joseph Harris would in fact take William Leo Hansberry's. Hansberry didn't have any books he wrote, but he had copious notes and had a file of a lot of different things that he had been writing in scholarly papers and so on. And what his student did, Joseph Harris did, was later on compile that into two books. One called Classical, one is Classical History, from the standpoint of blacks in classical history, and people would build on that, such as Frank Snowden and others would build upon it. Snowden has a book out called Blacks in Antiquity, a Greco-Roman Experience. And I think they built upon the works that William Leo Hansberry had laid, being a contemporary with Carter G. Woodson. Well, they were laughed out of town when that concept came up in that time period because, people had just been newly freed from slavery, and what history was there, they went beyond the reach of slavery, and that was kind of like the idea at that time. In fact, if you go and read some of these later scholars, like this one book out called From Slavery to Freedom, written by John Hope Franklin. And John Hope Franklin was a scholar. In fact, John Hope Franklin was the second black to finish Howard University with a PhD. The first one was, he wasn't second, he was like the third one, because the first person to get a PhD in a degree from Harvard University in history was W.B. Du Bois, having done so in 1895, and then Carter G. Woodson did so in 1912, and then later on behind them came the writer of the book called From Slavery to Freedom, John Hope Franklin. Now, John Hope Franklin wrote a book which kind of shows you the mindset at that time period. It's called From Slavery to Freedom. So here's a scholar, got a PhD from Harvard University, and he's writing a book called From Slavery to Freedom, as if people's history start off in slavery. But that shows you something about the mindset, right, in terms of how that's just on the other side of those who are denying that it could be in history at all, because slavery is the beginning point. And then even though that would not be the idea that John Hope Franklin had, even his own unconscious state, he is actually catering to that point of view. So you can see you can get some idea of what the problem was when Carter G. Woodson established that as a week. And even a week was looked at as 7 days. What is that? You can do that in a couple of hours. But he fought for it in 1926. It was an idea whose time had come, but it wasn't yet accepted as such. And it took some time for it to become an idea that we should in fact grow it into the institutions, and also grow it in terms of the amount of time that it would be observed. It wasn't until 1976, by the way, 50 years later, that you'd have Negro History Week, now stretched into a month, which became Black History Month. And it happened in the same year as we had the bicentennial, which was 1976, which celebrated the 200th anniversary of the country, and then to enlarge upon the idea during that time period that blacks were there also. I mean, people will tell you that blacks were a black person named Christopher Attucks was the first one to die in the American Revolutionary War, which that would be not that is a stretch of history, but I do understand the claim. They're trying to put black people into the time period of when the country was founded upon the Declaration of Independence. Blacks are right there in the forefront of the efforts to fight the British for its independence. But Attucks was actually killed on March 5th, 1770. So that would not really be within the domain of the Revolutionary War, because the war has not yet been fought. The war really is on as a I mean, there are certain things leading up to it, certainly, but it wasn't actually being fought for independence until July 4th, 1776, when they, in fact, got in George III's face to tell him that they were leaving, and if he wanted to do anything about it, here were some guns that saying that they were willing to confront him militarily. And The redcoats were made more red because they were determined to back up the claims they had written in that document with their weapons. And John Hancock, by the way, was so belligerent that he wanted to write his name above all the other names on that document, the Declaration of Independence, and make sure that George III didn't need to get the specs in order to see his name on it. His name was the first one on there, and it was he wrote it in capital letters to make sure George III could see it. But when blacks say that Crispus Attucks, Crispus, Crispus, Attucks, Attucks, was the first to die in the Revolutionary War, that's not really true. But he did, in fact, he was the first one to die in that particular battle that was fought when the British guns, a British soldier, guns went off I guess they were changing the guard, and the gun went off, and there were there people rushed them, and there was some additional firing that went on, and 5 persons died in that particular altercation. So they're going to call that the Boston Massacre. And it was 5 people that died.
You know what I think is so unique about that, though, the Boston Massacre, is that actually there was a defense of the British soldiers that actually were responsible for this alleged massacre. I mean, it was really kind of a stretch to use that term, but there was actually a good defense, and they actually weren't just railroaded or butchered down, cut down the streets. That just shows the class of people we had at that point.
Yes, but there are 2 points to be made here. There is a class of people that would stand up against tyranny. I want to see some of those persons today, but I mean we got more tyranny now than we had then. But the other point on the other side of the fact that we have those kinds of people in the colonies at this point, and these are some intellectuals as well. I mean, in America during this time period, according to Ron Chernow's book on Hamilton, you could tell we had a certain amount of intellectuals at that time because America had more newspapers at this time than any other place in the world. So the population was a literate population at that time.
Alexis de Tocqueville wrote that in Democracy in America. He made the observation. I don't know if you knew that, but he actually traveled through the area we are now sitting in, Flint, Michigan. He actually was in this area. And there's actually a marker that the library at U of M is supposed to put up somewhere. It's like actually a marker of where one of the routes he was in. But he remarked about this area, the area they consider the Midwest, or back then it was the Northwest Territory, that how intellectually these people had Shakespearean troops. A troupe that performed the Shakespearean plays and stuff here. Matter of fact, the Shakespearean troupe here, actually Michigan, in the Genesee County area, is one of the oldest in the United States. Mm-hmm. I mean, and that, I don't know if it still exists, it was a few years ago. Mm-hmm. But I mean, yeah, there was a great intellectual format here. I mean, there was people could speak 2 or 3 different languages. But now they can barely speak one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you go back and look at those tests that were taken during that time period before they had these government schools, it's amazing what those. I mean, they had on the internet this morning an 8th grade test, and they were saying 77% of the American people that take that test fail that test. Well, I would hate to give the test today to those that are even college graduates they took back in that time period in grade school, because it just shows you the kind of literacy that was in place during that time period, and before they had these government schools that got us to pass these tests where. I don't think anybody in Congress could pass that 8th grade test. I took it this morning, and they said I was in the top 5%. I just took it. It was 30 questions. It was nothing really difficult, 8th grade test. But 77% of the people failing that test, shows you something about the literacy of the country today. But back in that time period, we were a very literate nation, and that's why they understood the tyranny. George III didn't. Fool anybody, and they knew that they were not being represented, and that was even the issue. The issue was that they were doing things on the side that were subordinating the integrity of those that were in the colonies, and they were not buying that, and they stood up resolutely against it. And literate people will do that. When you have a literate population, that's going to happen because you cannot enslave a thinking people. Now, look at what we have today as a comparison of it, because what is going by us today would not have gone by those in the colonies. But we need to use Black History Month to keep the narrative straight and get the date straight. March 5th, 1770 is 6 years before the writing of the document by Thomas Jefferson, who was one of 5 members on the committee, one of whom was John Adams, who when he got to be president forgot he was on that committee and forgot his revolutionary background, apparently based upon his leadership as president, and he was thrown out of there for 4 years mercifully, and we got back to some of the strictures of the limits of government under Thomas Jefferson, who succeeded John Adams, who was the signature of the document and could understand what he was trying to do in writing it and carry some of those strictures into the Constitution. But let's get our facts straight as far as this month and what Black History Month should be doing. We should not further cloud the historical testimony by adding things that are untoward in this celebratory month. We should correct the record. And that was March 5th, 1770, and that's not the same time period in which we are fighting this Revolutionary War to get independence from King George III and Parliament and from England. Now, it's interesting that John Adams, by the way, when the 5 persons were killed and they put the soldiers were put on trial, it's interesting that John Adams, who later on would be one of the persons that's assigned to write the Declaration of Independence, he gives it over to Thomas Jefferson because Jefferson's a better writer than he was. Not so much in John Adams's case. We don't see Adams, for example, writing any of the Federalist Papers. We don't see Jefferson writing any either, but that's because when the Constitution is being fought for and we're trying to get it ratified, Jefferson's over in France. But the point I'm making is just that when the British were brought to trial, the person that defended the British soldiers was John Adams, who is one of the persons that was on the committee to write the Declaration of Independence. So how is that? Look at if that were the person dying in the Revolutionary War, it'd be a contradiction for John Adams, who is writing about the Declaration of Independence, to be defending the British soldiers when they're fighting against the British soldiers. So that can't be sustained. And that's not what Carter G. Woodson was trying to do. Carter G. Woodson was trying to add to the clarity of history by adding some more of his players in it. To talk, for example, that American history, and if you want to go larger than that, to world history, you cannot talk about that without talking about all of the members of the human family. That's really why I brought this book to the studio today. I brought 2 books. I'll just talk about one of them, and we'll talk about the other one next week. But I brought 2 books. One of them is called Africa Unchained, The Blueprint for Africa's Future by Georgia Yitte, and I'll deal with this book next week. But this week what I want to deal with is the book written by Arnold Toynbee. And anyone that is in history knows the name Arnold Toynbee, because Arnold Toynbee is one of those gigantic figures that was at the university. I think this university, quite frankly, was the top university in the world at this time. It had come out of the university that was in Spain, which was, I think, the University of Salamanca. That was in Spain, set up by a combination of the Christian influence and the Moorish influence in Spain, based upon in the aftermath of the invasion of Spain at that time in 711 AD. And then something like 300 years later, you'll see a university. I think it's the first university in Europe really that's set up. And out of that university set up, the University of Salamanca would be born the university where some of those scholars from that university would go into England, and they're going to set up this university called Oxford around 1200 and something. This is before Harvard, which is 1600 and something. So that university precedes Harvard, and it has tremendous prestige. And when you have the name Arnold Toynbee, Arnold Toynbee is is affiliated with with Oxford University. In fact, this book is put out by the Oxford University Press that was printed in 1947. It's called A Study of History. And I want to read page 54 of this book, because this book is some of what Carter G. Woodson was dealing with. Now, Carter G. Woodson in 1926, but the mindset that they had was what Toynbee would later on put in his book some 21 years later. So we're still fighting the idea that blacks didn't have any history, even though Carter G. Woodson is trying to validate that that is not true based upon setting up Negro History Week in 1926. But this book was written 21 years later than that, and this claim is still being made that, you know, black people are outside the areas of history, and they have not made any history. And on 54 of this book, he couldn't hardly wait to get to this in chapter 2, and it's called The Genesis of Civilization. And he's written blacks out of it on page 54. He makes these claims right here in this book called A Study of History. Now, it's not a study of history if you don't include everybody in it. And the ones who are not included are those that they're calling at this time Negroes and calling colored people. You can't find Negroes in the history book, so of course they're going to be excluded if you're going to call them by that name, because there's no place called Negro land, and you can't find them if you're looking for them under that derivation. But here's what Toynbee says on page 54 of the book. He says, acknowledges classifying white men in accordance with their physical types, long heads and round heads, fair skins and dark skins. Now we got dark skinned whites now. And all the rest of it have sorted out their main white races, which they call Nordic, Alpine, and Mediterranean. Now that would include, therefore, Egypt, because when you say Mediterranean, you now talk about Northern Africa, and Egypt is in Northeast Africa. So then Toynbee is trying to make sure he includes all these people. He's now calling some of them dark-skinned whites, and that would allow him then to exclude those who are now being called Negroes. For what it is worth, we will reckon up the number of civilizations to which each of these races has made a positive contribution. The Nordics have contributed to 4, possibly 5. The Indic, the Hellenic, the Western, the Russian, the Orthodox Christian, and possibly the Hittite. The Alpines have contributed to 7, possibly 9. The Sumeric, the Hittite, the Hellenic, the Western, both the Russian offshoot and the main body of the Orthodox Christian, the Iranic and possibly the Egyptian, and the Minoan. The Mediterraneans have contributed 10. The Egyptian, the Sumeric, the Minoan, the Syriac, the Hellenic, the Western, the main body of the Orthodox Christian, the Iranic, the Arabic, and the Babylonic, they have contributed to 10. Of the other division of the human race, the brown, meaning thereby the Dravidians, people in India and the Malays and Indonesia, have contributed to 2, the Indic and the Hindu. The yellow race have contributed 3. The Cynic and both the Far Eastern civilization, namely the main body in China and the Japanese offshoot, that would consist of 3 civilizations. The red race, don't leave them out. Of America, of course, the soul contributes to the 4 American civilizations. Then he gets to black people, called Negroes this time and called colored at this time. And he says, the black races alone have not contributed positively to any civilization. And then he puts a line there, and he says, as yet. So there's still some hope in 47. They have not done anything in history as yet. And of course, he's said that the Mediterranean race, and they created a race around the Mediterranean, they created a race around water. And they're going to call that the Mediterranean race. And that would include, therefore, all of Northern Africa. And Northern Africa would be starting with Morocco and going from Morocco to Algeria, and from Algeria to Tunisia, and from Tunisia to Libya, from Libya to Egypt, including all of that territory, all 6 of those nations above the Sahara, Mauritania over there, right below Morocco. And he's calling this, because it's on the Mediterranean, calling it the Mediterranean race in order to keep from calling it African. And so these are the ones that have, so therefore, since you're absenting blacks from it, blacks don't have any history. And that's the song and dance routine that's going on during this time period. And don't forget, this is 21 years now after College of Wilson set up Negro History Week to challenge that assumption. And it's being challenged further by other scholars during this time period. Some 70 years after blacks have gotten off the plantation. And they now have not only reclaimed their history, they have to also reclaim their citizenship. They have to claim the history, which is part of their reclaiming their citizenship, because if they're not human, then you can't really claim citizenship, because human beings have citizenship. So you get the history. Without history, you don't have any humanity, is the idea. So there's a fight now for the reclamation of their historical standing and grounding point, as well as their historical claim to being citizens, having been there at the beginning of the nation's history and all of that, and therefore they have the right to all the claims other citizens have, because they were there at that time period, and they're there in history as well. So that's what they're trying to do, reclaim their perch as far as being full-fledged citizens in the country. That's what College of Wilson is trying to do, and there are satellites that are in fact doing that as well. So this claim that he calls them, he says, let me see, his word, the word they use. I don't want to misquote him, because his nonsense should stand on his own. He says the black. He does say the black races, and he has that in plural form. So he's saying, he uses the word races for ethnic group. So he's calling different ethnic groups races now. The black races alone have not contributed positive to any civilization as yet. Now, when he says positive, have not contributed anything positive to civilization, he's talking about they have been involved in those civilizations, but they've been involved in those civilizations as slaves. So they have not actually been at the forefront of these civilizations. They've been, any contribution they made was a negative contribution, because they were out there picking the cotton and things like that. And Wilson is challenging that notion there at a primary place in this nation's history at the turn of the 20th century. You know, slavery didn't end to the last third of the 19th century. So at the beginning of the 20th century, the historical claims that are being made against these newly freed slaves are being challenged by these historians. And it's important at that time to put in place those things that the blacks had done and things of that sort. I think we have to change the way black history is being used now, though, because you need not talk about so much what the scientists did and all of that. I mean, that can be brought in, but we need to now have an interpretation of the history more so today, because we can no longer sustain this notion that Toynbee is talking about, is that they didn't do anything, just simply were in the way, and somebody finally put them to use out there in the cotton field and told them to get out there and get to work. and that's what happened there, and that's the role they play. Well, that's what Toynbee is contending, and Hugh Traver Roper also would come behind him and make the same claim, and so did M.D.W. Jeffers in a piece he did in 1951 called "The Negro Enigma," which he published in one of the journals, where he was making a lot of claims. There was a lot of the same kind of nonsense, where he could tell that all the bones had been uncovered back in the time period. None of those bones belonged to the black folks and all the ancient bones belonged to those who were not black. I don't know how you were able to determine that with no skin on the bones, but and they were found in Africa, by the way, so he was able to erase black people even from the soil of Africa. But what Wilson is trying to fight against that, and we have this time period set aside to, in fact, deal with that, and dealing with that was what he was doing at that time period. We can now build upon that and do some other things with this particular celebration. Okay, next week we will continue this discussion. We will talk about George Yete's book called Africa Unchained, and I'll be reading from page 105 of this book next week. Okay, we will get ready now for Satura's Black History Corner. They are the two hosts are in the studio right now as I speak, and they are telling me to get out of here. And I'm going to get out of this chair right now, and we will see you next week at this time, 2 o'clock to 3 next week. Until that time, I want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.